ClinicalTrials.gov. So just a little background. So we've got the federal regulations changing. We've got some changes to FDA regulations regarding some minimal risk research. We've got ClinicalTrials.gov regulations that have changed. We've got the certificate of confidentiality regulations, which we just got the notice 3 days ago that they're changing as of October 7th. ICH GCP regulations have changed. So there hasn't been changes to regulations in decades, and now everybody's on the bandwagon to change everything. So you can see where there's a lot of moving parts. So there's going to be a lot of cooperation and collaboration that's going to be necessary for us, you and me, and the institution to make things go as smoothly as possible. This ClinicalTrials.gov has come to the forefront. So the FDA reg section 801 requires that a clinical trial be registered if it's an applicable clinical trial, which I'm going to give you a definition of. And it's any trial that was initiated after September 27th, 2007, and was still ongoing as of December 26th, 2007. Then, what's an applicable clinical trial? So it's trials of drugs and biologics, controlled clinical investigations other than phase 1s. Now it does include phase 1s of drugs, biologics that are subject to FDA regulation, or a controlled trial of a device and pediatric post-market surveillance. So why were the regulations changed? Well, there was an article in the New England Journal of Medicine in March 2015. Looked at 13,327 clinical trials that were subject to the old FDA regulation. It showed that only 13.4% of the clinical trials actually disclosed their results within the 12 months required by law. And 50% had disclosed the results or asked for a delay in disclosing the results after 4 years. Industry-funded trials were more likely to disclose results than NIH-funded trials, which were in turn more likely to disclose results than academic medical centers. There were 6,599 clinical trials that were overdue on reporting results out of the 13,000. Here's the zinger. The fine that's imposed, if you're not in compliance, is $10,000 per day per trial where you're not in compliance. If the fines were imposed back in 2015 based on this, sponsors would be responsible for $66 million in payments for the first day alone, adding up to over $24 billion per year. That's like the NIH budget right there, right? So, the NIH policy on dissemination of NIH-funded clinical trial information, this was a final rule, is that all NIH-funded awardees and investigators conducting clinical trials, funded whole or in part, will ensure that their NIH-funded clinical trials are registered at and that their summary results information is submitted to ClinicalTrials.gov. So this was the final rule, and they also then changed the definition of a clinical trial. So this policy is complementary to the requirements of the first couple of slides I went through. This policy applies to all NIH-funded research regardless of study phase, so now it includes phase 1s, type of intervention, or whether they are subject to FDA or not. Major expansion right there. So it was ClinicalTrials.gov, was clinical trials according to FDA. Now it's clinical trials also according to NIH. If the awardee or investigator is the responsible party, so what does that mean? If it's investigator initiated, the investigator is the responsible party. They're the ones who are supposed to be doing this, with assistance from the institution, which is what we have been providing. Oops. The awardee or investigator will ensure that all regulatory requirements are met. If the awardee or investigator is not the responsible party, so in other words, if it's a multi-center trial, it's the sponsor, the awardee or investigator will coordinate with the responsible party to ensure that all regulatory requirements are met. Each NIH-funded clinical trial should have only one entry in ClinicalTrials.gov. So one study, 25 sites, there's only one entry for it. In some instances, it may be the coordinating center that's responsible for that. That's something you should work out with, your project officer. So what's the updated definition? So a clinical trial is a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or more interventions. Where'd you just hear this? This is from the federal regulations. Assigned to one or more interventions, which may include placebo or control, to evaluate the effects of those interventions on health-related biomedical or behavioral outcomes. So this is a major expansion of clinical trials definition. So common rule and NIH are now harmonized. So if your study started before January 18th, 2017, you have to register per the old requirements. If your primary completion date was before January 18th, old requirements. If it started after January 18th, it's the new requirements. Or if your primary completion date was on or after January 18th, it's the new requirements. So a couple of moving parts here. So we look at when the study was stopped and started or could be completed, and that's where we make the determination. So what are the requirements? Initial registration is recommended before enrollment of the first subject, but no later than 21 days after first enrollment. You have to report or update when there's a change in recruitment status. So if you stop recruiting, you got 30 calendar days after the change in status to update ClinicalTrials.gov. All the studies need to be reviewed and released at least annually. Released means you've made a change and then ClinicalTrials.gov releases the record. You have to include results and adverse events. And you have to enter them within 12 months of the primary completion date. As of January 18th, the responsible party is required to respond to requests for changes or clarifications from ClinicalTrials.gov within a timely manner. There's a protocol and results section, and that gives you the amount of time to respond. And again, you get notices from ClinicalTrials.gov on this. So what happens? What has NIH said about what happens if you're not compliant? Well, they can delay and release HHS funding, whether it's remaining funds or future grants. You can get an FDA notice of noncompliance, which gives you 30 days to remedy your situation. You can actually be assessed civil monetary penalties, both the institution and the investigator. You can be subject to civil or criminal proceedings. Notices of noncompliance are going to be published in the public record. I think that's the Federal Register. I know of at least one instance where an investigator sent a study to a journal to be published. They said, "Where's your ClinicalTrials.gov number?" They said, "I don't have one." They said, "Sorry, we're not publishing your study." He then turned around and sued the institution, said it was their fault. I think it was his fault. But you can also see where there's potential for lawsuits against IRBs. Because if they're not going to publish your study, you're going to be upset. Right? So, per our SOP, sponsors and PIs are responsible for registering applicable clinical trials, depending on who the responsible party is. For investigator-initiated studies, clinical trials are required to be registered, and they will not receive final approval until proof of registration is provided. That's our way of monitoring. So investigator-initiated studies, UMB is the responsible party, work with the investigator, your study's got to be registered before you get final IRB approval. Clinical trials that are out of compliance with updating and reporting results may not receive approval at the time of continuing review until proof that the record has been updated and released to the public site. We've had instances where the PI has said, "Oh, I'm leaving UMB," and then they leave, and then the new site wants the record and we can't release the record, please let us know. Submit modifications to have another investigator assume the PI responsibilities, or submit a closure report. So we have a person in our office who is reviewing. So what we're doing is, for any transaction that is going to be reviewed at a fully convened IRB meeting, we're looking at those studies to see if their clinical trials registrations are updated and current, if it's applicable. Thus far, we haven't had people who haven't complied with the requirements of updating. We try to make people aware. We know there's a couple of changes we have to make in Cicero in order to ask the appropriate questions. That's forthcoming. So we're looking at full board agendas prior to the IRB meeting. For new studies, is the initial registration complete? If not, who's responsible? For continuing reviews, is the study status and the record compliant? And the study status updated? For modifications, is it the correct PI? Is the record compliant? In some instances, Cicero says the PI said this is not a clinical trial. But so again, the definition is now expanded, but the application says it's not a clinical trial. You may get a query to the investigator to say this now appears to be a clinical trial. We are attempting to gather as much additional information prior to the IRB meeting so that queries can be addressed, and it would be a modification required to secure approval and not a deferral. If the sponsor of the coordinating center is responsible, the IRB may still request determinations in certain circumstances. As I said, we don't specifically send things to full board for ClinicalTrials.gov. If a transaction's already going, we may add this information on. We haven't had anybody who's been non-compliant or had to submit an R&I, which is nice. The other thing for NIH, as another add-on, they released this new policy on good clinical practice training for NIH awardees involved in NIH-funded clinical trials. It went into effect in January, so everyone who either was getting a new award or had ongoing funding had to show documentation of GCP training. This includes trials that don't have to be registered with ClinicalTrials.gov, but it's NIH-funded. So that's been ongoing. And we have multiple examples of training that's acceptable. Any questions about that? Yes. It's a lot of info.
So if we know we're doing a study now that falls under the new expanded definition of a clinical trial, nothing prevents us from entering it into ClinicalTrials.gov now, correct?
Correct.
So we should just do it.
Just do it.
Okay.
Just do it.
Okay. And if the same grant is paying for different clinical trials, that's okay. I mean, we list them separately within the ClinicalTrials.gov database. Like a merit award, an R37 often will cover more than
I
one.
believe each study has to have an individual one. I don't think it's.
Okay.
I don't believe it's grant, but I would check with your program officer on the grant just to be sure. I don't want to be telling you.
It's going to get confusing, but we'll check.
Okay. I don't want you doing more work if you don't have to be. All right. Well, thank you.